Welcome to the Office of Undergraduate Research Education Series. Today's presentation is on the science of funny science communication, and our speaker is Dr. Sara Yo. And this is a virtual event. It's being recorded, so we ask everyone to mute yourself and turn off your camera to ensure the best experience. But if you have questions for the speaker, you can use the chat feature or unmute yourself when you're invited by the speaker. And this is the event evaluation. We would love everyone to complete that after the presentation, but we want to remind the Europe, Wilkes, and early exploration scholars that you must complete this evaluation in order to get credit for attending today. And the mission of the Office of Undergraduate Research is to facilitate and promote undergraduate, student, faculty, collaborative research, and creative works in all disciplines throughout the U campus. And we would like to acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The U recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the U's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. And now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Sara Yo. She's an assistant professor in communications.
Hey. If you would like to turn your camera on, I'd be happy to be able to see you. It's kind of always a little bit awkward to give a talk virtually because I'm mostly staring at my screen and it feels like I'm talking to myself. So, hello, Isaac. It's nice to see you. Hello, Jane. Um, my name is Sara Yo. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication, as Shelley mentioned. Hi, Grace. And you can, I don't know if we're calling it tweet, whatever X is now, right? Sure, you can use that, but I might not see it for a while because I'm not a lot on social media. But you can also feel free to email me or interrupt me as I'm talking today and ask any questions you would like. Feel free to just unmute yourself and say, "Hey, Ann, have a question real quick." Happy to answer those questions. So today I'm going to talk about some of my research. I'm a science communication researcher. Broadly, I think about how people form opinions and attitudes towards scientific, environmental, risk issues based on what they see in media. And a lot of my recent research has been on humor in science communication and humor as a tactic for communicating science. So let me tell you a little bit about how I got to science communication. So I got an undergraduate degree. I lived in Hawaii. Uh, I'm not from Hawaii. I am from Malaysia, but I moved to Hawaii for college. I went to a small liberal arts university, Hawaii Pacific University. I have a bachelor's degree in oceanography. I minored in chemistry. I thought I was going to study carbon cycling in the world's oceans. If you are a chemistry or science major and have taken chemistry, you know that there are PChem people, physical chem people, and that there are OChem people. I am a PChem person, hence chemical oceanography. So I did that, but I actually ended up doing microbial ecology. So I got a master's degree from the University of Hawaii in the oceanography department, studying kind of how microbes interact and respond to disturbances in the surface oceans. What you see here is Coconut Island, which is an island off the island of Oahu, which is where Honolulu is. My lab was on that island, so I had to take a little Boston whaler to get to my lab every day. From there, I decided I would move to Wisconsin because Hawaii is too nice. So um, I went to the environmental engineering department as a PhD student. And while I was there, I did a lot of outreach events, talking to science days, right? Talking to public audiences about the research that I do, which at the time still involved sort of microbial ecology and thinking about how, again, microbes cycle carbon in aquatic systems. Wisconsin has a lot of lakes and bogs and very interesting aquatic systems up north. And kind of when I was doing a lot of this outreach and talking to people, and these are very educated people who live in Madison. If anybody here is from Madison or Wisconsin, you know, right, that surrounding areas really kind of are built around the university and it's a very educated population. And even then, I would be talking about microbes and their importance to climate and carbon cycling, and we'd get somehow to talking about recycling, right? And so I couldn't understand why people weren't as interested in bacteria and microbes as I was. And so I took a course actually in science communication, and that really started my journey. I ended up switching to a small department, the Department of Life Sciences Communication. I got a second master's degree here, and then eventually got my PhD in mass communications. I studied how we sort of opt for our own information about science, and this often aligns with actually our partisan values, right? So Republicans tend to go to Republican outlets for information, even about science, even about kind of softer news like sports, even things like weather, right? And similarly, Democrats tend to read kind of their partisan media outlets for that kind of information as well. So that's not surprising to us now. But when I did this research, that was still pretty novel, especially in the context of science. And so this kind of circuitous journey to science communication. Well, and then from Wisconsin, I came here. The weather is much nicer here. It's much more sunshine. I like it much better. Not that I don't love Madison. So all of this kind of resulted in shaped what I study now. In general, I study public opinion about scientific, technological issues. So, for example, AI is a really big issue right now. We're thinking a lot about AI, right? And people's perceptions and opinions about AI in terms of security and so on. And I study this based on mediated messages, so information that you get from media, right? And this can be news, right? News websites. It can also be social media, right? Things that come from other people. I think about how we selectively expose ourselves to information. If anyone here has done a course in psychology, if we're thinking about cognitive dissonance and Leon Festinger's theory, right? How we avoid and, maybe tend toward information that tends to confirm our biases. And none of this is conscious, right? A lot of this is unconscious for us. We do this naturally. And then finally, think about information processing. Heuristics is just a jargony term for mental shortcuts that we use to make sense of new information, right? And some of those mental shortcuts aren't always sort of cognitive shortcuts. They can be values, right? So I might use, political ideology to make sense of new information. I might use my values related to religiosity to do so. And the other thing I can also use to make sense of new information and to process it is affect and emotion. So how we feel about something really influences how we process that. And so within kind of this sort of theoretical framework, all my research is around science and environment and risk. And then I have this kind of tangential area of research that I'm looking at that has to do with open science and open science principles and practices and the tools that we use, especially related to communication, but also just relevant for most sciences. I won't be talking about that today because I'm going to be talking about some of my research in humor. But before we get into that, let's think about why science communication is important. So here's some data from the Pew Research Center, and it shows the percentage of Americans that say science has had a mostly positive effect on society, right? And what we have is like the years, we have March 2016, January 2019, and so on, up until October 23. And you can see that there are fewer Americans now that say science has a mostly positive effect on society, and those are the blue bars, right? The kind of tan colored bars equal positive and negative, and then the green bars mostly negative. Okay, so what we see is kind of this declining, you might call it trust, you might call it confidence, right, in the effect that science has on society. So this is overall. Anyone can access these data. By the way, the Pew Research Center has a lot of information on public opinion about science and public attitudes towards science that are quite interesting to look through. So I encourage you to wander over to that website sometime after this talk and explore that a bit. It might be useful for research projects as well. So then what they also did was they broke this down by groups, right? So on the left figure here, you see overall US adults, which you saw earlier in the last slide, right? And then you have Republicans and those who lean Republican and Democrats and those who lean Democrat. And you can see that there are differences, right? If you just focus on the October 2023 bar, what you can see, the dark blue bars, right, have clear differences in them. Okay. If we now look at the graph on the right side, right? Again, same thing, percent of American adults who say science has had a mostly positive, equal positive and negative, or mostly negative effect on society, but this time by race, right? And so there's a lot of differences based on groups, right? Group identities that we have in society. Okay. And so, what this says perhaps is that we are, science, in communicating science, we're maybe not reaching all groups, or perhaps we're, um, right, might be able to do something better, perhaps. There are also educational differences on people's opinions, right, towards the effect of science in society. And what you see here is that in general, people who are more educated tend to say that science has had a mostly positive effect on society, right? Those who have postgraduate education, 80% of Americans who have had postgraduate education say that science has had a mostly positive effect on society, and then it decreases from there. Okay, so again, group differences, right? So if we look at very specific topics, right? For example, climate, it's not surprising, I think, to most of us that the divide on opinions toward climate change, right, has grown, especially based on partisan ideology. So whether you're Democrat or whether you're leaning left or right politically. Okay. And here the differences are quite stark. Uh, to compound all of this, right, these gaps that we see in opinions in society, opinions towards scientific issues, most of us actually don't get a ton of science education, right? I think for some of us here, this is maybe quite surprising, especially if we're in a science major. But for most Americans, we don't get a lot of science education, right? So what you see here in this graph is the lifespan of an average American, right? So about 70 plus years on the x-axis. You have the time of day on the y, and then going back into the third dimension there, the z-axis, you have months of the year. And what you see is that there's amount of time spent in K through 12 education in college, so in formal education spaces, right? And science education is really kind of a pretty small drips into this amount of time. But there's all this space, right, that is not filled by education, that, we can get information if we're about science, if we're lucky enough, for example, to live in a place that has a great museum like the Natural History Museum, or a great science center like the Leonardo, right? But there are a lot of places where we don't have those opportunities for engagement with science, okay, where people don't have a lot of opportunities for engagement with science. And so a lot of this kind of space after we're done with college is filled by what we get from media, right? Information about science, about most things that we get from any kind of media, social media, online news, right? Newspapers, TV, and so on. Podcasts. And what media used to look like was this, right? When we had, in the broadcast era, we had three TV networks. News went on at about the same time in the evening, 6 o'clock, right? And you might have had some inadvertent exposure to public affairs information. There might have been science information on there, right? You might have had some inadvertent exposure because the TV was on, maybe while you were having dinner, maybe you were waiting for the entertainment program that came on at 6:30. And so you might have seen some public affairs news or some science news. And we all had these shared media experiences, right? We all knew kind of what was the topic of the day, right? So that, you could go to work the next day, you could go to school the next day. And if you happen to catch the news the night before, you could have a conversation with someone else about it, and you could be talking about the same topics, okay? So we had these inadvertent exposure, and we had shared news experiences. And what you see now looks more like this, but is very much more diverse than this, right? And we get to pick and choose what we read. And so if somebody didn't want to read news at all, right, and wanted to focus entirely on Billie Eilish, that is entirely possible in today's media environment, right? That's not to say that inadvertent exposure to news doesn't happen. It still does, right? But it's maybe less likely given sort of the combination of our ability to select information, algorithms kind of, right, learning from our behaviors and media and what we choose to read and driving us to more content. Okay. And so maybe we have less of these shared media experiences, less inadvertent exposure to public information, to science news. And then when we choose to read science, what we often see, right, because science journalism generally is decreasing. Most journalists tend to be generalists instead of specialists when we used to have science journalism, and science journalists specifically at large media outlets, right, they were specialists in what they reported on. It's more common now that science news is reported by a generalist journalist. And so we get a lot of science information from social media. So here are a few that I pulled out just as examples, right? We can use hashtags to sort of keynote them, I guess, right? To kind of archive them. But the other thing that we have is we have reactions to it, and we know who posted it, right? And so these are contextual cues that have to do with interaction. We are, in some way, there's much more interactivity on new online media. We know who's posting it. We know who has liked it, right? We know how many people have liked it. We can read the comments that follow. And all these things also play a role in how we make sense of this information. Okay. And our attitudes towards this information. So a really good example I like to use is if you are on, I don't know, any social media. Facebook is a really good example because that's often where people connect with folks who maybe they haven't seen for a really long time. And maybe in, the time in between that you haven't seen each other, your views have diverged, right? And they post something that maybe you don't agree with, but perhaps you don't need to read the whole post to know that you disagree with that because you disagreed with that person. Okay. So these are the kinds of contextual cues that social media affords to us in kind of this new media environment. And so a lot of my research, given this background, right, of the gaps in public opinion, the changes that we have to our media system that most of us I shouldn't say us, most of you might have grown up in, right? My research kind of looks at how we can be strategic about communicating science. Okay, so this is a figure from a recent textbook called Strategic Science Communication. There's goal setting and objective setting, and those are actually different. In this framework, we think about goals as behaviors that you're open to changing, right? Behaviors that scientists are open to changing. And I think some scientists are not super comfortable with that, right? The idea that you're persuading someone to do something. But if we think about, what is that behavior that you want? Having an audience be aware of a particular topic is not necessarily a behavior. And what we've learned is that when we just want folks to be aware of something or to have more information about it, we're very good at rationalizing that information to fit our pre-existing worldviews, right? We've seen this a lot with issues like climate, with issues like vaccinations, things that are already kind of polarized, okay? And so thinking very specifically about what are those behaviors that you're willing or open to kind of changing with your communication. The objectives is setting the objectives, kind of beliefs or feelings or any frames that might accomplish this behavioral goal. And then there's tactics, right? So this is very specifically about what are the specific characteristics of the message that I will use. And so this is where most of my research falls, right? Thinking about what kinds of tactics might be effective when it comes to communicating science. And this is really where humor comes in. And so most of my recent research has been about humor in some form, and primarily humor on some type of new or social media. Okay, and I'm gonna share just two examples of the research that I've done. But before we do that, I'm gonna just share with you some funny posts. So this is obviously from Twitter. So this is before it became X. As you can see, that these are kind of old. But there were some funny hashtags used on Twitter. So overly honest methods is one of them. And this is just scientists taking to social media to post about just real things that happen in the lab, right? All of you are doing research, and so you know that sometimes things don't go as planned, right? So this is kind of like pulling back the curtain and giving, they are public tweets. Anybody can look this up, right? And so just kind of giving an idea and poking fun at the process of science, right? Poking fun at the scientific enterprise. Okay. Um, and then there's also the hashtag fieldworkfail. This is an artist kind of rendition of some of the tweets that we're using these hashtags. So these are actual tweets by scientists in the field, things that happen. If you've been out in the field, you know these things happen a lot, right? And you often have to just make it work. Okay. But one of the things that we know from political communication, so people have studied things like satire, which is what this is. This is satire. This is sarcastic. It's poking fun, right? In this case, it's poking fun at the sort of process and institution of science. But in political satire, we know a lot of these from late night TV. So Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, right? Its predecessors, The Daily Show, um, and the Colbert Report. We know from a lot of those studies that have studied political satire that it can sometimes undermine trust in political institutions and political actors, right? So, and if we kind of draw that out into making predictions about this kind of satire for science, does satire undermine, right, scientific trust in scientific institutions, trust in scientists, and so on. And so that was the impetus for a lot of the research that I've done. But then once, of course, like anyone else, when you get into the research, you realize satire is actually quite hard to manipulate in an experiment because it's so subjective. We'll get to that. The other thing that we also often see is that humor is often something that is recommended. It's something that we use in our daily lives, right? We all, have funny moments, make jokes throughout the day. We like generally to laugh. But what we don't know is what is the effect of humor when you're using it and talking about science, right? You could imagine that if you're using self-deprecating humor, this might undermine your own expertise or people's perceptions of your expertise. And those are empirical questions, right? We can answer those questions. We can do research and answer those questions. But surprisingly, actually, it hadn't been done before I started this. And so what I generally do and the form my research generally takes, I primarily do survey research, and most of my work is experimental. So I often vary the contents of a message. I then measure some intervening psychological state, uh, and then some persuasive outcome, right? That is sort of an ideal or brought on by that psychological state. The other thing that plays a role in here are individual traits. We talked about values, for example, or individual predispositions. There are also psychological traits, especially for humor, right, that could play a role. And we'll talk about this. So this is generally the form that most of my research takes. And we'll talk first about one study thinking about how humor is associated with people's engagement with science, right? How does it encourage people to engage with more science or not? And so what I did, because part of my research is also in the open science realm, I'm very interested in replicating and the ability to replicate things, right? I think there are a lot of social science studies that do one study and then kind of leave it there. I do think replication is important. And so I'll also share the replication of this with like a larger sample and 3 different issues. So we'll talk about the first study. So what I did was manipulated the type of humor that was in a post. I'm going to show you the post in a minute. But I manipulated the type of humor that I showed to people. I measured their intentions to engage with that content, right? But also that psychological state that's in between is the experience of humor. We call this mirth or experienced mirth or experienced humor. It's also amusement. Sometimes mirth can be sort of an external reaction, right? We can laugh, for example, we can smile. But sometimes it's also not, right? Depending on how funny the joke is, doesn't have to be external all the time. Okay. And then the individual trait that we're interested in here is a psychological personality trait, right? It's this idea of need for humor that some of us, we all fall on this scale of this trait. Some of us prefer to have a higher need for humor. Some of us have a lower need for humor. This just means that maybe some of us like to be around funnier people. We like to be the source of humor, right? And we're all different, okay? We fall on this continuum of this personality scale. And so we can measure all these things with survey questions. There's actually a validated scale for need for humor. Um, and here I'm going to show you the actual manipulation. So if we started, and this is a joke that I got off Twitter, right? So we had to have a control condition. This is the no humor condition. It's just a fact about atoms, right? Atoms are composed of electrons, protons, and neutrons. When an atom loses an electron, it becomes more positive. We had the same number of retweets and likes. Everything was the same except for the post itself and then the response at the bottom, right? The response here is also just informational. It becomes an ion is what that says. You can probably see where this joke is going. So this is the original joke. There's two types of humor in it, right? It says two atoms are talking. One says, I think I've lost an electron. Are you sure? Yeah, I'm positive, right? I see some smiles, some head shaking, and this is, right, there's wordplay in this. It's a pun. Lost an electron. Electrons become more positive when they lose an electron, or atoms become more positive when they lose an electron. Um, and then there's also anthropomorphism. Two atoms are talking, right? These are human-like characteristics. In the figure, you can see they have little faces, they have arms and legs, and the tiny electron in the figure is running away. It also has legs on it. And then the response is also has wordplay and anthropomorphism, right? You got to keep an eye on it, okay? And then the anthropomorphism part, another atom is talking, right? So that's two conditions, and they're the very end points of the condition. So the no humor at all, you'll also see that the hashtags are science and hashtag fact. The joke condition, hashtag science, hashtag funny. And then there's the two in-between conditions, right? Where you only remove one of the types of humor, either anthropomorphism or wordplay. And again, everything is consistent except for the posts and the response to it. In the case of wordplay only, there you just have the pun, right? And you have two scientists talking about it instead of the two atoms talking about it. And you have the atoms have no faces, no legs, right? The little electron doesn't have legs and it's not running away. In the anthropomorphism condition, you've taken the pun away, right? Instead of I'm positive, yes, I'm sure. Okay. So what we did was we assigned people randomly to one of these conditions. So each survey participant only saw one of the four conditions that you just looked at. And then we measured how funny they thought it was, right, on a 7-point scale. And what we find is what we expect, right? In the condition that is the original joke, so the combined condition where there's anthropomorphism and wordplay, they found that the funniest, right? The anthropomorphism and the wordplay are somewhere in between. The no humor condition is the lowest, so that's great, right? So respondents in the combined condition reported the most humor. They thought it was the funniest, or they had the highest levels of mirth. And there's no significant statistical difference between the two conditions in the middle, the single dose of humor, if you want to put it that way. Okay, which is what we expect. So great, experiment worked, nailed it. But what we see then, right, is that when you look at the changes in humor and relate that to intentions to engage, so this is intentions to engage with more science content online, and we asked folks that, right? There is a negative relationship there. However, if this relationship is mediated by mirth, so if they thought it was funny, right, then they were much more likely to engage. And so this is a positive finding, right, for using humor and using very benign forms of humor like anthropomorphism and wordplay. You can tell there's no biting, sarcasm, satire in here, right? But even then, there is still this kind of negative direct relationship. And we think that some of this is probably because when you read the whole joke, you laughed maybe a little bit, but you also thought it wasn't a very good joke. And it's true, it's not a very good joke. So perhaps if you didn't think it was a very good joke, you might not be likely, right, to engage with that content. which uh, is consistent with what we found, right? So if you think it was funny, you're much more likely to engage, but chances are if you didn't, you weren't that interested. Okay. The other thing we found is need for humor. That personality trait really kind of changed this latter relationship between how fun, your feelings of mirth and your intentions to engage. And I'll show you that the numbers are very hard to interpret, but what you see here is that persuasive outcome on the y-axis, so intentions to engage with the conversation, and then that intervening variable experience mirth here on the x. And they're both measured on 7-point scales, which is why we have the 1 through 7. And then you'll see 3 different lines, one for folks who are low in need for humor, and then medium levels of need for humor, and then high in need for humor, right? And what you see is among those who have a high need for humor, that the more funny you find it, much more likely you are to engage. But if you have a low need for humor, the slope of that line is a lot less steep, right? So for those with higher need for humor, those who experience greater mirth, so those who thought, right, it was funnier, also reported greater intentions to engage with science content. Okay, so all this to say that these kinds of individual traits do matter, right? Okay, so great. That was the first study we did. It was kind of a pilot study in this line of research for us, and then I wanted to replicate that, but I wanted to replicate that not just with kind of a basic chemistry science joke. I wanted to replicate that with topics that we think about, right? Topics that maybe are in the news, topics that you know some people know about. And so we picked 3 topics. One that is kind of obscure, so this idea of microbiomes, but there is a small subset of the population who talk about microbiomes online, right? In the context of microbiomes, there's often conversations about the gut microbiota and kind of replacing that in some way. And then we had AI, artificial intelligence, which at the time that this study was done was not as much in the news as it is now. And then there's global warming, a topic that is quite controversial that has been on the public agenda for quite a while. And so we use different types of humor with these different topics as well. So same setup as before. For each topic, you had 4 experimental conditions, right? One with a no humor, one with 2 types of humor, and then 2 conditions in between that had a single type of humor. And the humor types are listed there at the bottom of the slide. So with global warming, we used wordplay and satire, right? With AI, we used anthropomorphism and satire. With microbiomes, we used anthropomorphism and wordplay, right? So in 2 of these, there are kind of biting forms of satire. Okay? And I'll just show you the whole, like the funny, combined 2 types of humor jokes, right? So you have global warming on the left, AI in the middle, and then microbiomes on the right. And these, I drew the first images from the last study, but these are well beyond my abilities. There's another science communication researcher in Australia, actually, who also used to be a comic artist. And so he drew these for us and is a collaborator on this project. And so we have the same thing. We have the content, right? We have the hashtags. Every condition has the same number of retweets, the same number of likes, and then we have a response that kind of emphasizes the condition. Similar to that last experiment. Okay. Okay. And so we did the same analysis, and what we see here, again, very similar to that first graph that you saw in the last study. You have humor type on the x-axis. You have experience of mirth on the y-axis, a 1 through 7 scale. The humor types are different because you have global warming, right, on the left panel, AI in the middle panel, and microbiomes on the right panel. And so the different humor types are shown there. And in the AI and microbiomes topics, respondents in the combined condition reported the highest levels of mirth, exactly what we expect because that's what we saw in our last study, in our pilot study, right? The 2 in the middle are not different from each other, okay? but the no humor is generally the lowest and the combined condition is the highest. But in the global warming, what we see is that generally the levels of mirth experienced are the same across the conditions, right? Across the four conditions. And so that really didn't conform to what our expectations and our predictions. And we think it's likely that it's because it's such a polarized issue. There's so many kind of differing opinions on this particular topic, right? That what one person finds funny in this case might not be funny for someone else. There's also, I will also say, if I go back one slide, what you'll see is in the global warming condition, there is one type of humor that is also always there, right? So it's global warming on the far left. So this is supposed to be satirical and it's supposed to have wordplay. But the other thing it has, and in all four conditions it had this, was anthropomorphism. The snowmen are talking, right? The dinosaurs are talking. They're gesturing with their hands. They're doing human-like things. So that might also partly explain why we have kind of similar levels of mirth across the four conditions. Okay. And then we also measured need for humor. We used exactly that same model and we find, right, the same kind of in line with our previous findings. Those with highest needs for humor also were most likely to engage if they found that content funny. So as we expected, and it was really nice to have replication across topics as well. Okay. So why do we care, really? Well, one reason we might care is positive emotions can be kind of a promising tactic for communicating science, right? Especially given, decreasing confidence in science. In general, research shows that if a communicator is likable, they tend to be more trusted. And so, right, thinking about likability for scientists might be important, not just, right, sharing information and knowledge. We know that mirth is positively associated with support for various actions. We have some other research on climate action, right, that shows that mirth can be, if you find something funny, that might encourage you to support some type of climate action. We also have done research on hope, right, that might help us reach folks who are less concerned about certain topics. In particular, this was done in the context of climate change. A lot of climate research looking at emotions deals with fear and anger, right? Not so much about hope and positive emotions. We know that humor is associated with greater engagement intentions. People who find something funny are also much more likely to engage with that, at least for non-controversial issues, and when using non-biting forms of humor generally. Right? Humor also makes scientists more likable. We have done some work that examines, right, how scientists using humor might change their perceptions of both their expertise and people's perceptions of how likable they are. It increases their perceptions of likability and it doesn't decrease their perceptions of expertise, right? So using humor and being funny doesn't make people think you are less of an expert or less credible. But the type of humor does matter, right? So if we use biting forms of humor, we know that that doesn't work as well. And it can certainly be more polarizing. And so, benign forms of humor are safer, but they're perhaps not as funny, right? So often satirical posts, and this is why Last Week Tonight, The Daily Show, things like that are so funny. It's because they use satire, they use a biting form of humor, which we tend to find more funny than something like wordplay or anthropomorphism or slapstick. Okay. And so in science communication generally, we've thought about cognitive appeals for right effective communication of science, but emotional appeals are also important. Some of our research shows that it has a lot of effect, right, on communicating science. Science is something that we generally think of as rational and I think what psychologists would call cold, right, unemotional or devoid of emotion, and that's something that I think as scientists we try to keep out of our science research. But when we're communicating about this, because we're doing so in a social world and we use emotions in many contexts, just in our daily lives, turns out that that's also important for communicating science. Okay. With that, I will talk very briefly about current and future projects. So most of my research is done in collaboration with people who do the actual communication of science. I do the research in science communication, and they do the actual practice of communicating science. I work with PBS Digital Studios. We have a grant thinking about expanding audiences for science on their YouTube platform, which is called Terra. I am working with this organization called STEM Media, which is a minority owned. It's owned by an engineer media company looking at cultural relevance in science, right? Cultural references and how they might be relevant to science. We're using hip hop science in that context. And then I have kind of a line of research on open practices and communication. And the last thing I want to share with you is about the STEM Ambassador Program. So if you have any research, we are a training program that guides researchers to leverage their research and their personal experiences and their interests to build relationships with stakeholders and with communities who might benefit or might be interested, right, in their research. And so we are a semester-long program. You have to apply to uh, be part of this program. But we also try to focus on bringing science to spaces that are not, that are generally underserved and underrepresented when it comes to science, right? So places where maybe you wouldn't expect to see science. So it's not always just an outreach event or a science fair. We try to go to senior centers and correctional facilities, engage in art spaces, for example. And so that is a program that I serve as director of. And if you have research, right, um, you might be interested in it. So with that, I will stop there and take any questions that you might have.
I have one question from a registrant. Someone asked, can I make jokes in a paper or is it only during verbal presentations?
Oh, that's a great question. So because I work with practitioners, I often publish and have co-authorship with them, share co-authorship with them. And I've worked with some comedy writers, and there's a specific Hello SciComm is a specific science comedy writer, run by a science comedy writer, and she likes to include jokes in there, and they've actually gone over pretty well. They make the papers a little bit easier to read, so I'll try to have one or two jokes in the introduction, and maybe one in the discussion or something. And so I have done this in journal articles. Uh, I don't think I'm the only one in this. So it's not just about jokes, but I think I have colleagues who try to include, their favorite football team in there somehow in one paper. Um, I think I referenced like a hip hop artist in one of my papers one time. And so, you have to make it fun for yourself. So, and if a reviewer asks you to take it out, then just take it out. But I don't really think there's anything wrong in including a verbal joke as well, as long as it's clear that it's a joke and not offensive, I would say. But I think that's a general rule for using humor too when it comes to communicating about science.
I have another question from a registrant. It says, how can I check if the usage of humor or other tactics for public audiences is too excessive or inappropriate?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's also an empirical question, right? And so there is, trying it out and knowing that you might not have to cut it. Also, if it just kind of seems like it might offend someone, it probably will. And so there's really only an empirical answer to that question in terms of trying and testing it out. Um, and I think we're often surprised by what does offend and what maybe doesn't offend. And so kind of not assuming that something will be offensive or that something won't be offensive is quite important if you're trying to do this as well. Um, yeah, one thing that I often use, even when I'm teaching, is self-deprecating humor. And that's, you know, kind of up in the air in terms of how does it undermine perceptions of your expertise, right? I think maybe there's a threshold of this. I actually haven't done that study yet. It's on the agenda to think about self-deprecating humor. But my hypothesis is that there is a threshold at which point using self-deprecating humor will become detrimental, right? But below that threshold, it may not be. it may be funny. And then that way, the only target is yourself. Um, and so that, that's a question that I have. I also think that threshold is going to be different depending on who you are, right? Depending on your identity, depending on how you present to other people. And so there is an interesting research question around the use of humor, especially the use of self-deprecating humor, and who you are as an individual, right? What gender, what race, for example. Um, there's often, I think gender is especially true, right? So anecdotally, if you think about comedians like Samantha Bee versus John Oliver, there's quite a difference in people's perceptions of them. Sometimes people say Samantha Bee is an angry woman, right? When she's talking about something and making jokes and being satirical about something, versus John Oliver, who I think if you step back is also kind of being angry about something or could come off as angry, but more people think he's funny than angry. So there's a question in the chat. So do
Mm.
you think that there is a fine line for using jokes in papers, such as naming a genus or species after pop culture references? One genre that come to mind are the dinosaur named Thanos and another dinosaur named Gremlin. Is that perceived as immature? Oh, that's a really great question. I think again, that is kind of an empirical question, but I don't hate it. I don't mind a dinosaur species named Thanos and Gremlin. It's easier to pronounce than a lot of the other ones, so that makes me pretty happy, I think. But yeah, I think that there might be. I mean, I don't think every dinosaur should be named after a superhero, but some of them could be.
Another registrant question is how can you balance humor and professionalism in a research presentation?
Yeah. Um, that's a great question. I think to the best of your ability, right? Being able to balance that is a little bit of a judgment call, but if you're worried about it, I would err on the side of fewer jokes. And this is, I think, where in terms of public speaking, practice matters a lot. You gain experience as you use the jokes. I have given a similar talk sharing my research with folks many times. And so I've been able to kind of beta test jokes as I go along, right? And some audiences are going to be more friendly than others. I also really encourage practice talks with your lab, with your mentor, right? Pretending, right? A mock talk, pretending that you're in a formal space and giving that talk and using those jokes in that practice time to get feedback is a really good way to figure out whether it's appropriate or not. I think some jokes we all sort of inherently know are not appropriate in a formal presentation setting, right? But there are some that we can test out, especially if we're able to practice. And I would always encourage folks preparing for a talk to give them beforehand.
Another registrant question is what are some academic papers that have made you laugh the most, and what science do you remember from them?
Oh, generally academic papers don't make me laugh, but um, science do I remember from them? I'm trying to think of titles. This is like an on the spot question. I'm gonna have to find titles of because there are some researchers who will put something funny in the title because it's much more likely that people read it, right? If you're able to read the funny title. And that of course has to do with citation metrics and so on. But off the top of my head, I can't think of any one. So maybe they're not all that memorable. Maybe they just in the moment are more amusing and I'm maybe more likely to cite them. I don't know. That's a good question. Although if you come across any funny ones, please send them to me because I'm going to use them as examples. I feel like most papers don't use humor in them actually.
One more. What do you do when it seems like people are uninterested in hearing what you are saying, but are listening out of respect?
Yeah, that's a good question. I try to push through, right? I mean, you're maybe there to give a talk. This is kind of what you said you would do is give this talk. There's a lot of distractions in today's world. I don't expect everybody to be paying 100% attention to any talk I give, and that's also okay. I know that even at conferences, especially when they give you hashtags for the conference, people might be tweeting the last thing you said, and so, kind of not taking offense at that and pushing through, and somebody is listening, hopefully, right? And so, really speaking to that individual is important. There is another question in the chat. Dave asks, what about cross-cultural implications? Yes, different places are different progressively. So how do you balance something that may seem like pretty mundane attempt at humor to you with something that someone across the world may take offense to? Yeah, that's a great question. And so the question of cultural relevance and cultural differences is really important. And thinking about, so there are certain types of humor, right, that it is a cultural, and it is subjective, and it can be cultural. um, but there are maybe some forms or techniques or types of humor that are more universal, right? Which is to say, I'm not saying go out and do a slapstick routine, but that often tends to be kind of a general, more universal form of humor. The level of like what we find funny, right, versus others might find funny is different. um, but I think a big part of that is understanding the audience, right? So part of understanding the culture is understanding your audience in terms of who is going to be reading whatever you're putting out, or who's going to be at the talk where you intend to use some of this humor. And so I think that, and maybe this is just general sort of presentation advice, right? Always know who your the majority of your audience is going to be. There are a few times where I wouldn't ask who might be in the audience before I prepare a talk or before I give a talk. And so that I'm able to kind of connect um, better, if that makes sense. For a paper or presentation, what would be the best place to put a joke? I would say the best place to put a joke is where you have practiced it, especially in a presentation, right? And as you get more comfortable, you might be more sort of, as you get more comfortable with the presentation, you might be more comfortable throwing jokes in. But being mindful about what kinds of jokes you're throwing in and where and whether it's appropriate, right, is important.
Here's the QR code for the evaluation form, and I just put it in the chat, the link. Just remember the Europe, Wilkes, and early exploration scholars must complete this in order to get credit for today.
And if you're interested in research on humor and science communication, email me, let me know. I work with honors students and Europe students, so please, and Wilkes students. So please email me.
And I just want to thank Dr. Yo for this great presentation. It was informative and funny. And I want to remind everybody the Office of Undergraduate Research, we're in the Sill Center, which is just east of the Union. We're open Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. Our website is our.utah.edu, and you can email us at our@utah.edu. Thank you again, Dr. Yo.
Thank you. Good luck in your research.